Howdy, all you delicious people. I'm here today to review Hannibal Rising. So, I feel that I finally have gone on and seen all of the Hannibal Lecter kind of movies. And so, of course, there still is shows and stuff like that to eventually get into. But now that I've finally finished up all of the films, now I feel like I need to go on and grade all of them, and I hope I am going to try to do these fairly quickly. So, with that said, easily the number one film is probably The Silence of the Lambs, fairly easily, just because it has a really interesting story. It has a character that has their own origin story where I feel like everyone else is already there, or you should know who they all are, or eventually gives us a story that doesn't really quite all that matter. Um, so, with that said, Silence of the Lambs is easily the best film, and then we, of course, have Red Dragon, that is a very close second. I really like the investigation of that film, even though we obviously have to note that that movie is a remake. That, of course, has Manhunter to exist before that one does, and it kind of goes on and is to give us the feeling of it, of course, being second because it's not all that original. Eventually, I may go on and check out Manhunter if it seems that people are intrigued by that. But eventually, this could be possibly the last Hannibal Lecter thing that I go into, with the exclusion of probably Clarice or Hannibal Lecter or Hannibal if I go on and check that show out at some point. So, with that said, and I think I've gone on and I've seen at least the first season or first couple episodes of Hannibal. Not quite sure, but like I've seen most of that. So I've kind of I'm kind of familiar with that kind of show. Anyways, we now have to determine whether Hannibal Rising or Hannibal are to have fit in the third spot. And honestly, for the third spot, this movie is to take a while before it really actually gets interesting. But then when it actually does get interesting, it gets interesting for the rest of the film. It is to go on and remind me of a plethora of different kind of comic book kind of characters, even though it's a very dark and gritty film. Uh, Yeah, so this movie immediately comes off as a slasher kind of movie that is to be just a little bit more exciting than, of course, the movie at the fourth spot, which, of course, is Hannibal. Hannibal Rising is just more exciting than Hannibal, but that's not by much. Both of them have stories that I don't give a rip about. Really, for Hannibal Rising, it's just wait till he starts killing people, and that's the only intriguing thing about the whole entire film. Nothing matters. None of Hannibal's origin story in this movie makes me really care. Dare say, like the story is basically garbage, and whatever it needs to be for the time of which that this movie needs to come out. Really, for Hannibal Rising, this gives me comic book character like vibes. If you go on and you basically look at uh, Magneto's backstory from X-Men First Class, and you look at Hannibal, it's basically the exact same story. But if you also go on and look at like a possible like Bruce Wayne Joker combination with Hannibal Rising, I would not have that not be a justifiable argument also. But like this movie also comes across as being similar to The Crow in a lot of ways. So really, to not feel that Hannibal Rising is all that original, and to also probably only be done simply because Batman Begins was, of course, to have been done, and a number of other just kind of origin movies of certain characters. So it felt like everybody had to go on to, at some point, some origin stories of certain characters. because they had no more story left to give. So, with that said, what is my grading on Hannibal Rising? Where can you go on and see it? So on and so forth. Hannibal Rising is a okay movie. Like, I only really enjoy it just because it reminds me of a slasher film where, of course, it's in the later kind of franchise where you're rooting for the killer and you don't care about the innocent bystanders who are eventually going to get killed at some point in this film. You're waiting for them to die because they're very, like, of course that's going to be the person that the killer goes after. Of course. Because we have Lecter, who in this movie is to, as per always in every one of these movies, that he just can't tolerate ignorant people, and so he's making examples of them because they're horrible people and they deserve to die. So, in some ways, you can almost see like Hannibal Lecter as Dexter a lot, with the conclusion of a lot of times Lecter was to go on and work with the police force to the point where he was to almost get caught simply by him going on and talking to the police far too often. So, with the exclusion of just Dexter, does not go on and eat the people he kills. So, with that said, let's go on and tee this movie up. Where can you go on and see this movie? Well, I'm not quite sure if this one is easily available anywhere, so I'm going to list off the bootleg apps that you can go and check and find. So, C Movies app, you can go on and Google search this, hopefully be able to find this app, be able to download it, be able to find that this movie is going, or this app is going through an update, and download Yes Movies app, and be able to go on and see whatever you like. A ton of movies for absolutely free, with the exclusion of certain movies that I'd like to see currently right now to the second this recording, that just doesn't have the availability for me to see any freaking where. Like, I wanted to see the John Goodman movie Matinee, and I wanted to see this movie called Career Opportunity. I wanted to see both of those movies, but I couldn't find them anywhere, it seems, even with the apps that I've mentioned. Go on and check out these trailers and see if you have the money to be able to want to rent these films. But yeah, I wanted to go ahead and see both of these, but I couldn't find them anywhere, so it ticked me off. But of course, I can rent them on Amazon, but I don't do that kind of thing. I just don't. So, moving on. We have another app called Fox HD Movies. The logo that says Fox HD Movies, but the title that says Play 1080p HD Movies. Hopefully that'll help or hinder you find that app quicker. Not quite sure. At the end of the day, go ahead and say that you could hopefully find this app somewhere. Next. On a Google Play Store, at the second of this recording, there's an app called 123 Movies that you can go on and download that seems very similar to the app that I'm going to tell you about right now. You can go into a Google search and search the words TV Crush. Eventually you'll find that TV Crush is to have updated its logo and its title to be called HD Movies 123 Movies, and eventually you'll go on and find a app that is to have an HD Movies King Kron off to the side. Go ahead and download that app and be able to watch a number of things for absolutely free, even with subtitles. There's sometimes where there's movies that you may need to go on and need subtitles because maybe you can't hear all that well, or maybe eventually you just want the luxury of having certain films with you seeing the English subtitle down below, because you can't go anywhere else and see a subtitle movie with English subtitles at the bottom of the screen. So there's that for you. Check it out. Slap it down. You know what I'm saying? Slap it down. So, I don't know, that was random. So, now going on into Hannibal Rising. What is this thing about? So, we of course have the origin story of Hannibal Lecter, which honestly, to me, like, I don't care about this movie until about 39 to 40 minutes in, and then I'm interested. So, we go on, we have Hannibal. who is to have a family that somehow oddly owns a castle because Hannibal Lecter is almost the equivalent of Dracula. So, Count Lecter. All right. So, we all of a sudden have Lecter who somehow or another has his family own a castle and the rich, and they end up being forced out of this castle to go on and live in this lodge because they are hiding out from this war. Because this is right around the time of 1944, which is right around the Holocaust, and they are living in Lithuania. So we go on and have this family who is to be gunned down because they are Jewish, to eventually have a number of military guys be living with these kids. And we start to go on and realize that these men are starving, and these kids are to be the only real nourishment that they can possibly have as far as a food source. So, guess what happens? Not Hannibal ends up getting killed here. And because, of course, this is what this movie is all about. If Hannibal would have been killed, if they would have flipped a coin and said Hannibal's it, this movie would have been a lot shorter, but it wasn't. So, we then have Hannibal, some way or another, ends up getting away from these military men to then go on and jump the Soviet border to then go off to hopefully find what is left of his family, to find out that his poor uncle had died. Eventually, having Hannibal go on and have this certain relationship with his aunt, because technically they're not really family anymore. And so Lecter is to go on and have this family that is to go on and teach him certain techniques from another culture that he is unaware of. And so then Hannibal Lecter is to become the weirdest and goofiest knight in shining armor kind of character that is to defend his lady's honor, and is to then go on and start to eventually start killing people, and goes on to eventually realize that he needs to avenge his sister's death because, of course, he had made a promise to go after them. And so now that it seems that Hannibal is strong enough and knowledgeable enough, Hannibal is to go on and find all these guys, kill all of them, and get the revenge that he so rightfully deserves. Even though it seems that there is an inspector that is trying to stop Hannibal barely in this film, to where this guy is barely in existence in this film, and I laugh by the fact that we actually have an inspector even trying to do anything in this film because it feels like a waste of time to just be having this guy in the movie, because we have so much of a focus on Hannibal that the inspector is just some goofy guy that is just there to just, like, well, we have to have some kind of, like, moral good side of things that is to, like, try and, like, prevent Hannibal from killing. We can't just have Hannibal that are just, like, decking all of these guys and, like, easily, like, getting away with it. There has to be some kind of inspector or something that's looking into this, because we have to try to make it look like there's an investigation going on within this movie, because it can't just be about killing, right? Anyways, so let's go on. So let's double fire this bad boy up. Let's go into what is to be spoiler time. Spoiler time is about that time to spoil this movie. So, really quickly went over in a teeing up version of this whole film. Hannibal, of course, wins at the end. Like, do you think that he's gonna go on and not win in the end? He's gonna win. It's gonna happen. So, we go on in the beginning of this film, which of course takes place in Lithuania, 1944, in Lecter's castle. So, we start this movie with, of course, Hannibal and Misha, who are going on playing around, and so Hannibal's father is telling him, hey, like, we need to get out of this castle, because war is a brewing, and so we need to get the heck out of here. to go on to this lodge. So they're horse and buggying their way to this lodge, and so we have a Lecter. We have at one point Lecter going on and talking to his father about what's going on here. But so they're hiding out at this lodge, getting this bathtub to eventually, or this bath. Uh, like it's not really a tub; it's more of like this metal container that looks like a bath. And so we go on into this story, and these characters are to be locked into this lodge, hearing over the radio what is going on with this war, hearing that I guess some of the Germans are to have gone on and starting to starve and starting to get tired. So, on the other side of things, we have the SS Major, who is to go on with Brutus and a number of his men to start weeding out some of the Jewish people and probably take them off to a side of a wall somewhere and have them all be shot, or have them be shot in the middle of the road somewhere, because that's what usually happens. So we go on to have this SS Major who pulls this chef and is telling him, like, hey, considering you're Jewish, like, I'm not going to have you cook my food. So we go and we have Brutus, who is to pull a man aside and is to ask, like, hey, like, how can I tell whether or not you're really Jewish? And so he's looking at this guy's ears and this guy's nose, and so they're like, well, hey, pull his pants down and you'll probably figure out by that. So these guys are kind of joking around with this guy, and the SS Major is to, like, not tolerate this, so they immediately just go on and kill this guy because he's obviously Jewish. So we go on and eventually have some dissension in the ranks, some friction that starts to happen. So Brutus is to more and more be potential to be an SSR soldier, and so this SSR Major is to consistently tell Brutus that he's so close. So we then go on and have Brutus, who is to get sick of waiting for the SS Major to go on and pull the trigger about him really legitimately being a soldier. So Brutus goes on and takes action into his own hands and is to kill these ambulance drivers, and is to tell the guys to only shoot them in the head so the clothes don't get bloody. So they go on and they kill these ambulance drivers and are to go on and eventually kill off the SS Major and eventually go into business for themselves to try to loot and try to get rich and try to get the heck out of there. So we go on and we have Brutus, who is to eventually keep driving around to eventually find this lodge. So Brutus and his men go on to find this lodge and immediately pull out all the adults and one by one start killing them off, to where it seems that only the wife and the kids seem to be in the house left by themselves. We had also had moments before this happened where where Lecter's mother was to go on and put her pearls into this stuffed boar, and we also have Lecter's mother who is putting these letters into one of these drawers and kind of leaving it behind. So we go on to eventually, but the whole letters things were left by the castle. They weren't left at the lodge. That's one thing that I guess I have to clean up here. So as they were all leaving, because Lecter's mother ended up just grabbing the jewelry and left the letters at the castle, but then she pulled all the jewels and shoved it into this boar at the lodge. So let's clean that up. So Brutus goes on and is to eventually kill all of Lecter's family members with the exclusion of his sister, and Lecter's mother ends up really just dying in his arms almost. So we then go on to have the guys being in this lodge, and eventually we have guys who are going out and getting food. So at some points it seems that the first thing that they give to Brutus is to be this very frozen rabbit, and Brutus is kind of getting ticked off at these guys because it's like, well, wait a minute, like this rabbit doesn't look in all that well of condition. Like you've got to have something better than this. Come to find out, they ended up killing one of these birds, and so Brutus ends up grabbing the bird and leave the rabbit for these guys to eat. So the more and more that these guys are starting to realize how long that this war is really going to be, the more they start to realize that they are starting to starve, and the more they start to realize that they are to find out certain information about this family. We have Dortlich that goes on, Dortlich, and finds out that the one oldest son is to be Lecter, Hannibal Lecter, and the daughter is to be Misha. And so they're going through these photo albums so that way they have something to burn on this fire so they can keep this flame alive. So we then go on and have the guys who are just looking at these kids for meat, just thinking like, okay, like since they can no longer find an animal to eventually keep them hungry or keep them fed, we then have them start looking at both of these kids. And so I'm going to go on and tell all the early stuff, all the flashback stuff right now, instead of going on and doing it later, because it's easier just to do it this way. So Brutus and the guys are to look on as these kids, and it seems that Misha is to have pneumonia. And so they're naturally thinking that this girl is probably going to just die anyways because she's the most unhealthy between the two of them. So they decide, like, well, she's dead and Lecter's going to live. Because I guess somehow or another, this girl is to go on and be enough food for them for the rest of the time that they are there for, until eventually everyone eventually goes on and leaves this lodge to go elsewhere. So, we go on into this story and eventually have Lecter, who is to run off and eventually be found by a number of soldiers, as Lecter is to be chained up and he falls over from exhaustion. So we have Lecter that is to be brought to his former castle, which is now to be a orphanage, where he is going to be trained and put into exercise and be given food. So we go on and we have Lecter that is not singing when, of course, they do their like kind of national anthem song, I believe, in this film. I'm not quite sure. So we have Hannibal that goes on and is to not sing, and the one monitor guy is to be upset because, of course, Lecter isn't singing. But there is to be a lot of times where, of course, Lecter is to go on and scream and howl in the middle of the night because, of course, he is to have horrible nightmares. So we go on and we have Lecter, who is to have this fork, as this guy is to try to put a hand on him, and so Lecter is to stab this guy in the fork, or in the hand with a fork. So, of course, the one thing that Hannibal attacks somebody first with has to, of course, be a fork, right? Makes all the sense in the world. So Lecter is to be taken to this headmaster, and the headmaster is to completely understand Lecter's story, where technically the place of which that he is to now live in with all of these people used to be his own castle and was forfeited to be given to this headmaster and all of these guys. So saying that at one point Lecter's family was rich and now they aren't, to have him be the only one left of this family, and so on and so forth. So the headmaster is to know like how bad this guy's past is and how horrible it was. So he's trying to be lenient upon Lecter. But so we go on, we still have this monitor that is still butthurt by Lecter and is say like, hey, you're gonna pay for this wound that you had given me. So Lecter is just kind of sick of living within this castle, and so he decides to leave. So Lecter goes on and is to break out of his place that he's being held in, goes on to find all these letters that his mother had left still at this castle that they did not throw away. So Lecter then goes on to eventually jump the Soviet border by, of course, having this scarecrow that is to keep this guard and this dog busy, while Lecter is to try to jump this gate and make his way past the Soviet border. So we then go on and have eventually Lecter making his way to supposedly where his uncle is to live. Come to find out, when Lecter is to meet up with his supposed uncle, he is to find his aunt there instead, realizing that his uncle had died many years ago, and so only his aunt remains. So Hannibal is to go on and eventually start living with his aunt, and is to eventually go into med school. He is to go into the Institut de Médecine Sainte Marie in Paris. So Lecter is to go on and become this med student and is to become very educated. He is to be dealing with cadavers and stuff like that. So we have Lecter that is also to take an interest in what his aunt is to go on and do at night. It seems that she is to go on and clean these samurai blades and is to have this samurai of which that she has had in her family. So we go on and we have Lecter, who is to find out the past of her aunt's ancestry. And so he goes on and starts cleaning these blades, and then is to also kind of find out that I guess these guys used to chop off people's heads and have pictures of them doing it. So that all of a sudden has Lecter starting to learn how to draw. And he ends up starting to sketch all the villains of which that he wants to eliminate at some point from his dreams. So we also have Lecter, who eventually is to become such a good student that he is to be involved in possible cases with Inspector Papil. And so Papil is to go on and ask this guy and give him some truth serum and ask him about where were these kids hidden. And so eventually this guy, through this truth serum, is to deliver some information. And so we then go on and have the inspector talking with Hannibal. So eventually Lecter is to take this truth serum so that way he can be able to hope that his dreams will give him more information than the flashes that he has had in the past. And so they do. So we have Lecter that goes on to be with, of course, his aunt, who is to actually be Lady uh, Murasaki. I'm going to call her Lady through most of this, or I'm going to call her Lecter's aunt so that we don't butcher that name consistently. So, we have Lady who goes on through this market where all of a sudden we have this guy called Paul the Butcher who is insulting this woman by kind of doing some racist name that he keeps calling her, and is to mention that I bet this girl's nethers is quite different than any other woman's because it's probably positioned a different way. So Hannibal is to go on and take offense to what this guy has to say, and is to be the lady's knight in shining armor, and is to try to go on and attack Paul the Butcher, which all of a sudden gets this inspector involved, and is to mention to Hannibal, the inspector does say this, that Paul seems to be very hated by a lot of people, so when really looking at it, the inspector is not going to go on and arrest Hannibal for anything and just let him go. Just say, like, hey, don't go on and try to fight this guy again. So we eventually have Hannibal that is to take an interest in Paul the Butcher, to have him be the very first person that he goes after because of what he had said to his aunt. So we go on and we have Hannibal that goes into training with his aunt, with practicing with these wooden swords, to have Lecter be good at samurai training, and eventually having Lecter start to fall for his own previous aunt. So we go on and have Lecter, who is to take one of these samurai swords and find Paul the Butcher fishing. So Lecter goes on and is to find Paul and is to want to get into another fight with him. But this time around, we have Lecter who is to easily take Paul down by taking these swipes of these samurai swords into Paul, having him start to continue to fall over and how he cannot seem to get back up. So Lecter is to go on and show Paul his own face in this picture that has already been chopped off. And so Lecter is to take another swipe at Paul and have blood on the paper. So Lecter then goes on and is to finish up Paul by chopping off his head. And so we then go on and have Paul's body that is found by these inspectors without a head, and they are trying to figure out what had happened. So we go on and have the inspector who is to try to find out all the people that Paul might have had a grudge with or been in fights with, and come to find out the most recent one is Hannibal Lecter. So we then go on have Inspector Papil, who goes to Lady's place and is to go on and start questioning whether or not she or Hannibal Lecter could be the killer of Paul. Seems that there is no real true hard evidence to go on and say there's a possibility that Paul was to be killed by either the lady or Lecter, so the inspector has nowhere to really go with here, but to just try to tell Lecter that he's on his case, hoping that at some point Lecter may confess to any murder that he has to have done, because that's all that the inspector really is to possibly have here. So we go on, we have Lecter who presents Lady with Paul's head, and is to say that it was fitting to have Paul be killed by the samurai sword because of how this guy was being racist towards Lady. And so Lady goes on and tells Lecter to clean up, and eventually Lady goes on to dump off this head and eventually wear like head to toe uh, of a disguise so no one realizes that it's her delivering this head off. So we then have Lecter, who is telling Lady that he's going to go on and go after all the people that had killed his sister. And so Lady is trying to persuade Lecter not to go on and do this. And eventually they kiss, and Lady is telling Lecter to not go after these people, and for that he she wants him to promise to not go after them. And Lecter is to tell Lady that he can't promise because he already promised his sister that he would seek out revenge. So it's a little bit too late. So Lecter is to go on and start finding these men. And so eventually what happens is that Lecter tries to go on and slowly but surely try to find these men and try to lure them out. So we go on and of course have Lecter a lot of times using these dog tags to make these guys aware of what's going on. So we go on and we have, and this seems so much like Magneto's First Class and all those superhero films, but still, we have Hannibal that at first is to meet up with Dortlich to try to get where all the other guys are first. So we go on to have Dortlich, who is to start to follow Lecter, as Lecter is to make it back to this lodge and start to look through there and start to find the jewelry that his mother left and the skull and bones of his sister, and goes on and tries to bury his sister in this bath, and that's her burial. So while Dorlich is to look on as Lecter is to go on and be at this lodge, it seems somehow or another that Lecter is to go on and figure out what Dortlich is doing and gets the upper hand on him. And then we have Dortlich, who is to be tied to this tree with a horse consistently pushing forward and more forward to tighten the ropes on Dortlich with this little noose. So we now have Lecter that is asking Dortlich where all the other men are. And eventually he continues to tighten and forces Dortlich to sing this song. So, because of course we have in the past where Dortlich is to go on and sing this little song to the kids to, I guess, try to keep them calm, and has this little teddy bear in place. So we eventually have Dortlich, who is to mention that a guy named Grentz is to be in Canada because he had went on to a refugee boat and got away from here. But all the rest of the guys are to seemingly be right around Fontainebleau. And so that is the one place where, of course, Hannibal is to go on next. So we, of course, have Hannibal, who ends up eating Dortlich's cheeks and then chopping his head off. And so the reason of that is because eventually when Hannibal had went on to eventually kill Paul the Butcher, he brings over this fish, and eventually the chef is to mention how the cheeks are probably the best part of the fish, as well as all other animals, or like the cheeks are to be the best part, So eventually, Hannibal eats the cheeks of the guys that he is to kill, and I guess that is to be the best part of the body for this guy to eat. So to the point where the inspector is to mention how Hannibal had brought this fish home, and how it seemed that also Paul the Butcher was also fishing also, but it seems that Hannibal is to ask the inspector, like, well, hey, like, where were you between that time and that time? Like, I can give you an alibi. I can tell you that you were fishing with me if that's what you need to eventually be like clear of you being a suspect in this murder. So we go on, and we of course have Hannibal that is to make his way to Fontainebleau. Um, so we of course have Hannibal realizing that one of the men is to seemingly own this restaurant. So called Calmness. So Lecter is to go on and be at this restaurant, and is to go on and give this girl this dog tag for Calmness, and is to also take this bracelet from her hand, because of course this bracelet is actually Lecter's sister's, and so he keeps it. So Calmness is to go on and find out that his daughter has his dog tag, and she's like, "Oh my god, he's like, "Oh my god, Lecter's here." So we have, of course, Calmness, who is to find Gruntus and let him know that Lecter is in town, and that he's probably going to seek his revenge and come after them. So Gruntus is to tell Calmness to just go back to his restaurant, like, don't even bother about this, and for them to eventually go on and try to figure out where Lecter is to be now, and I guess he is to still go on and be this med student. So they're like, yeah, we're going to go on and go to his school and eventually go after him and try to kill him. So we, of course, have Milko, who goes after Lecter. Milko ends up going on to eventually seeking Lecter out in this school, this medical school. So what ends up happening is Lecter ends up getting the upper hand on Milko and ends up dunking him in this cadaver tank, and is to now ask where all the other men are. To where, of course, Milko is to give up all this information, and then eventually after that, we, of course, have Lecter that is to then dunk Milko into a, God, what was it? The a certain kind of other tank also. It's like Imodium or something like that. It's some kind of certain kind of chemical that you would put for dead people, and I don't remember exactly what it was called. But I know it probably says somewhere. So we go on and we have Lecter that is to pour into the liquid into this tank to then drown Milko. And then we, of course, have Lecter going on to meet with Inspector Pipoli, because, of course, Pipoli is to naturally assume that Lecter is to go on and to have started killing these guys, and he knows about war crimes and stuff like that, and so on and so forth. And so Pipoli is to try to convince Lecter to not go after these men, but eventually Lecter is going to go after them anyways, but he's not going to tell the inspector that. So we then go on to have Lecter going after Brutus, who is to now decide, instead of like, he is starting to decide to sell off all of his women that he is to probably prostitute out, for Brutus to sell all the other women but keep one for himself, and then have her shave his chest. So, in this tub. So, Brutus is to want to go on and have this girl adjust this steam with this shower, and it seems that Lecter is to be in this shower, and so eventually, because he continues to no longer can take the heat anymore, he gets out. So, Lecter is to make his presence known to Brutus, as of course, Brutus is getting too close of a shave from his woman, to the point of him wanting to hit her again, but instead he's like, no, I like you, so maybe I'll even fix your teeth at some point, yada yada yada. So, Lecter is to want to go on and eventually figure out a way to burn Brutus, but it seems that all of this ends up backfiring, as we end up instead having Brutus ending up running off before he ends up leaving this area. He tries to fight off the woman that he's with and kills her and then runs off. So we then have Brutus, who is going from his place to then just deciding to go on his boat, but he wants to go and kidnap Lady Murasaki, and eventually is to call Lecter, letting him know that she is now be like taken by Brutus, and Lady is going on and telling Lecter to kind of hear all the sounds that are going on in the background, so Lecter can figure out exactly where they are. So Lecter is to figure out exactly where this is, and so we now have Lecter going after Colnus. So we have Lecter, who is to go on and tell Colnus that Lecter has Colnus's daughter. He has this body part, or this kind of organ that he shows to Colnus, making him think that his daughter is possibly dead. So Colnus is in a fear here, and so Lecter is to go on and tell Colnus that he, of course, is to go on and want the information of where Brutus is, and Colnus gives him that. So Lecter is to go on and let Colnus call and use his phone to then ask his wife that's at his house whether or not his kids are okay, and his daughter, and so the woman is to go on the phone and tell Colnus that all the kids are perfectly fine, and Colnus is like, oh my god, like he played a trick on me, and Lecter's like, yeah, I played a trick on you. So Lecter then goes on in to give Colnus a fighting chance, to put this gun off to the side, to hope that Colnus can go on and defend himself. But instead, Lecter goes on and jabs a knife into Colnus's throat and kills him. So, having the blade kind of go up. So, we go on, and now Colnus is dead. So now Lecter is to go on onto this boat. So we now have to realize also that we still have Grentz, who is in Canada from a refugee boat, and so there's still that guy who is just still kind of in the wind. So we still have that going on in this film. So we have Lecter, who is to find the boat that Brutus is on, and we eventually have Brutus, who is consistently kissing and licking uh, Lecter's aunt, doing all kinds of weird. It's weird. So eventually, when Lecter is to showcase himself, and both Brutus and Lecter are fighting it out, we have Brutus who mentions and justifies to Lecter at some point in this movie that if the roles were reversed and Lecter had his sister starting to starve, would Lecter feed Brutus to his sister? And Lecter goes on and says, like, without a doubt I would. And so Brutus is like, well, that's love. Like, you loved your sister enough to go on and do that kind of thing where I loved myself enough to justify killing your sister to eventually eat her and survive. And that's kind of like the interesting dilemma of like, well, yeah, if the roles were reversed, anybody would probably go on to do the exact same thing. So, anyways, so we go on and Lecter and Brutus are fighting, and eventually gets to the point where Lecter has to figure out a way to take down Brutus and to tie him up to this chair. And we have a moment where Lady is running off, and Lecter is to go on and say that he loves his aunt, and his aunt turns to Lecter. Is to mention it's like, well, what is left to love? Because it feels like at this point, for how things have twisted and turned, and the brutality of it all, that maybe these people aren't who they are anymore. So that both of them might be monstrous. Because we go on and we have Inspector Popoli, who ends up going on and doing this lie detector test for Hannibal, and Hannibal never flinches. And so Inspector Popoli is to mention that there's a possibility that Lecter, whatever was human in him, was gone after his sister was killed, and that the only thing that is really left is monstrous. And just kind of covering that, because eventually Papali was to go on and want a lie detector test being done on Lecter, and I almost forgot about it. So Lady leaves, going off onto the boat. Inspector Papali is to be there to question Lady and get her statement. So Lecter is to go on and chomp on, of course, Brutus's cheeks and kill him off. And so the next thing we end up seeing within this film is we have Lecter that is to make his way to Canada and is to go on and kill Grentez, as he, of course, to show him a picture of his severed head, and is to show his dog tag to him, like reminding him who he exactly is. And so Lecter goes after this guy and kills him. And that's how the movie just kind of finishes up. So, let me know in the comments below how you feel about this movie. At the end of the day, people could like it, people could hate it, people could go on to feel indifferent about it. So with that said, I think I'm just going to go on and finish this up so I can get out of here. Let me know in the comments below how if there's anything that I missed about, if there's anything I skipped around about, or whatever. Embalming fluid. Embalming fluid, is that what the... Is that what it was? I think that might have been the real thing, because I remember I've seen a number of different like morgue kind of movies and shows. That's what happens when you watch a lot of zombie movies. Embalming fluid might have been the right thing to have said there, but I didn't say it right. Oh well. But let me know in the comments below what that really was, if I was correct or if I was incorrect. Eventually be more specific for whatever reason. But anyways, I'm going to get out of here. Goodbye, everybody. Goodbye, everybody.